Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. I will start by summarizing a verse, an ayat of Quran that we find in the 4th chapter, Surah Al-Nisa. And it's the 135th verse. And in summary, it just says, speak truth, even if it's against yourself, to those in places of power, be it a wealthy or kin. And in this speaking of truth, you shall find justice. And I try to guide my life, and I hope that these comments are guided by that edict of the Quran. While Islam, as a faith tradition, does not advocate absolute pacifism or categorical nonviolence in every situation involving human contact, the use of violence and warfare is strictly prescribed and limited to actions that are necessary for the defense of human life and the protection of justice in all situations. This protection of human life must be in a struggle against injustice and aggression, and not an attempt to gain temporal power or material gain through violent means. When justice and peace have been restored in the aftermath of a conflict, Islamic law compels Muslims to cease armed struggle. Even in the cases of armed conflict, the concepts of not harming non-combatants or civilians is clearly articulated in Islam. In a speech given by the first Caliph of Islam, Abu Bakr, on the occasion of a military expedition to Syria, Muslim combatants were ordered not to kill women and children, the elderly, or harm those who they encountered who were monastics or people of the book, like the clergy of other traditions. Islam inclines toward peace as a state preferable to armed conflict. The use of force in Islam is limited to defense, and Allah prohibits aggression. There's no tradition in Islam of an aggressive war. Any conflict is limited to defense. It is in defense, it is in the protection of yourself or of others. The use of weapons of mass annihilation, like nuclear weapons, is strictly prohibited because they are not weapons of conflict. They are weapons of devastation. And so to talk about weapons of mass destruction, no, it's a misuse of language. They're about eliminating us as we know ourselves. And so they have no place in warfare from an Islamic perspective. In the context of the United States, however, where we have one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse, Muslim populations in the world, it gets to be complicated to have these kinds of conversations about a just war, a war of conscience, when the diversity of the population of Muslims is so complex. And to have those conversations without talking about social disparities, among which the most tangible would be race, gender, and socioeconomic status. To have the conversation about a war of conscience in Islam in the context of the Muslim populations in the United States and not factor in those other elements is an empty conversation. When we think of the African American converts, or as they like to call themselves, reverts to Islam, who join the US military, often as a means of survival, coming from urban centers of neglect and decay, the conversation is very different than when you have a similar conversation with Muslims, probably second or third generation from immigrant households. You can't have the same conversation with those two populations, even though they're both Muslims and adhere to the same tradition. In the Islamic tradition, when the Muslim population is in the minority, the rules by which our lives are governed change. When you're in a Muslim majority population context where Muslims are in charge or leading the government, what we call fiqh, the laws of jurisprudence, are distinct from those of when the population is in a minority. And this is the kind of knowledge base that any conversation of this nature on conscience in war would have to be premised on. And in this context, in this very complex context as it relates to Muslims here in the United States and Muslims who serve in the US military, we get to a very sensitive issue where in some schools of thought, it could be argued that Muslims are prohibited by Islamic ruling from serving in any conflict that takes them to places where there are Muslim majority populations. So there are strong arguments that could be made from Islamic jurisprudence that Muslims serving in Iraq or Afghanistan in the US military are really acting against the tradition. But then you get back to, but what are their roles as citizens of this country? And what are their obligations? And which self do we privilege? We all have complex identities. You know, I'm Muslim, yes, but I'm Afro-Caribbean, you know, I'm educated and all of this other stuff. So when I engage, which identity gets privileged? And for someone in the military, it is the same dilemma. Which identity do they privilege? Is it their US patriotic identity, or is it their Islamic? And for those of us who are not faced with that choice, it is very easy for us to sit back and say whichever one. You know, the argument could be made for the US citizen, civic responsibility, or the person of faith, the Muslim. And both sides could have compelling arguments, but ultimately, it is an individual choice. And a choice that I pray I don't have to make, because it is a very difficult one. We've heard before that just talk about conscientious objection and the opportunity to do that. Well, for folks who come out of an immigrant background who are not very well steeped in US military history, or for the young people who get recruited in the urban areas of poverty in the inner city, that is not an option that is presented to them when they sign up. And we've also learned that it is not an option you could kind of default into unless you have a conversion experience. The option of conscientious objection, the reality of the conflict as people of faith they will encounter as they go through this process is not discussed. And maybe that is a place of some advocacy to let the option of conscientious objection be placed more squarely on the table as a viable option for those recruited into the military.